Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Beit Midrash. Hope everybody's good. Hope everybody had a good week since last time, and looking forward to continuing our learning together today. Um, Today we are moving on. We finished part one last week of To Be a Jew Today by Noah Feldman, and we're moving on to part two this week, where he's going to start addressing um, Israel by and large, as beginning with the idea and the concept of Israel and what does it mean for us today. So, as we like to do, I'll open it up if there were any opening comments, thoughts, reactions, and then we can kind of dive in a little more into it from there. If anybody wanted to start us off with their thoughts. Nobody wants to be the first to talk, huh?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of what percent, and I apologize for the noise in the background, I'll shut myself off. Do you have a sense of what percentage of the Israeli population at this point is secular versus religious? Is not the ultra-religious a very small percentage today?
Off the top of my head, no, I don't have a percentage. Um,
I should ask Rabbi Google, I'm sorry.
I say my instinct is it's probably a majority who are secular, um, and the ultra religious are probably like the far right religious are probably like the Haredi are probably a minority, a sizable minority. Um,
I think the Haredi are like 10%.
but it's a little bit of a complicated question because you know how we define secular and religious is different than how the Israelis define secular and religious. So I'm not sure you're going to get an easy answer to that question necessarily anyway. Is there anything you were asking though, Barbara?
I was asking from my own perspective of my experiences in Israel, family, friends. It seemed extremely secular. And of course, if they're the majority of people I know, it's only when you end up in Mea Shearim on Shabbat that you reach the other side of the coin. So I was just curious, and yes, I should have looked it up. Perhaps that's what Joshua did and had something. But thank you.
I was just saying last time I checked, I think Haredi were like 10%.
Mhm.
I think actual Haredi is pretty small, but
Well, ultra religious, not wanting to serve in the military.
yes, but you know, even secular Israeli, they might define themselves as secular, but might still be religious in some ways. They just define themselves as secular, as in not Haredi. TK, you had your hand up.
I did, but I think you started to answer my question, which was you said that there was a difference between how Israelis define secularism and how we might define it. And I was going to ask you to pursue that in what ways, or was that just a general cover statement or different opinions?
I think there are different opinions. So, when we think of secular Jews in America, we generally would define it as a non-religious, non-observant by and large. That they don't really observe Jewish practice generally. I think secular Israelis some secular Israelis would define themselves as secular and be very similar in that way. I think there are secular Israelis who would define themselves as secular, but would still um, find it unreasonable to not have challah and wine on Shabbat, not do Havdalah, not like they still wouldn't want to work on Shabbat. They still wouldn't work on the holidays. Are they going to be going to synagogue every week? Maybe, maybe not. But I think they still might define themselves as secular, but still have some observances that they are carrying on um, at the same time. So that's why like I think secular as we define it is not necessarily the same as how Israelis define it. Esther?
I found this chapter really interesting and fascinating, and I will admit I am not well read, but the concept of the original founders and secularists and Zionists as being anti-religion, and they weren't just secular. When I think of secular, I think of most of the people I know.
I do also.
Yeah, and so to read this, that it was really, they were against religion. They wanted this to be, a nation state, which I've had arguments with people about. But so that was kind of fascinating to me. And I think the whole chapter, the way he laid it out, and I really am particularly enjoying this writer because he takes things that we know, and lays them out in a way that really makes you think about it differently. And so I really appreciated that, and appreciated, his conclusion that we live in this state of conflict. It's like putting out on paper what I feel all the time. That we are in this constant state of question and conflict, and with ourselves and with other people and with the world. And I mean, I'm not sure it made me feel any better, but it certainly laid out something that I had never particularly thought about in this way from the beginning, from the very beginning, from the inception of Israel.
So uh, I'll ask you to elaborate a little bit. Like what parts of it were you finding that you were struggling and wrestling with as you were reading this chapter?
So first, the idea that Israel should be created as an anti-religious state, as a state that doesn't need Israel. God is a rock. God is not religious or spiritual. And to understand that it became something so different, really, today. Even, most of my relatives, many of whom were those original Zionists, are secular, but then there are a few parts of our family that are religious, not Haredi, but do observe and do believe and blah blah blah. So that the country has kind of become something that wasn't the original idea was kind of interesting to me. And I think also the British role and the and I understood, that the Palestinians refused that agreement to become, a state. And that was the beginning of lots of problems. But our role in that as well, that we knew this, I knew this, but to have it laid out, somehow to have it laid out in that way that he laid it out, it made me appreciate the difficulty for everybody so much more. Also there was a statement in there by some guy named Morris, ironically. My little grandson's name is Morris. But that who changed his views and felt like had Israel really taken over in the beginning and gotten rid of all the Palestinians who were there, and they were there, You know, we often hear there never was a Palestinian state. Well, there wasn't a Palestinian state, just like there wasn't an Israel state, but there was a Palestinian presence. But had we really taken over, we wouldn't have these problems, and that the mistake was that we didn't just get rid of them all to begin with. You know, I just hate to think about war. So those, you know, that is really upsetting to me. This whole concept that that survival, our survival in some respects, and some people may disagree with this, depends on war and cruelty and doing things that I don't like to think about. So that's just a little of what I thought about in reading this chapter.
That is beautifully said. A couple things that came to mind to me as you were talking is with your first point, I found his conversation about godless Jews in a couple chapters ago really helpful here in talking about the early Zionists, like, you know, and him pointing out that just as, you know, Marx replaced God with economics, and just as Freud replaced God with uh, id, ego, and superego, the early Zionists replaced God with a country and a land, and that was a fascinating, really accessible way to think about it. You know, I'm sure it wasn't universal, but I think it's a helpful frame for many of the early Zionists. And often in the past, when I've spoken about Israel and Palestine, I've kind of jokingly said, I just blame the British. And it kind of gave me a little bit of a validation when he's like, you know, the British really weren't all that helpful with this either. And they kind of did a lot of what they often do is they say, okay, well, we're done now, so we're leaving and you figure it out. So I've kind of said it jokingly in the past, like, it's all the British's fault. But, you know, there was a little bit of, yeah, you know, they really did have some of the responsibility in this conversation as well. But I think like Feldman and probably like many of you, I grew up in with a largely Zionist education, and similar to what he described, like, you know, we came into this largely uninhabited land, and we, you know, made it flourish, and we made the desert bloom. You know, we've done all these things, and look how amazing it is. And yeah, so there was some wrestling with that's not exactly, you know, necessarily how it happened either. And you know, as you know, my wife was talking about a different situation where, you know, there was a conflict between people, and she said, you know, this person has their version, this person has their version, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And that's kind of how I was, my takeaway from this is that, you know, the Zionist idea, the Zionist education I had their version, you know, the Palestinians have their version, and the truth and the reality is probably somewhere in between the two. Barbara Ayland, and then
if you're talking about last night, I think the quote from Orly is, "You don't have to be wrong for me to be right."
yes, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was specifically thinking about Torah on Tap last night, but she said it in other situations too. So, but yes, I think she did say that last night. Now that you're mentioning it, but yes, like, you know, just because this is my version of events doesn't mean your version is necessarily wrong. That there can be a space in which we're both right in some way, and trying to build from there. Lisa?
So I guess one way this chapter really spoke to me was that I've always, I've always wondered why Israel has such outsized importance. gaps, in the world. That it's just a country, it's just a people, and but it gets so much attention and so much emotion, and people arguing back and forth about this land and this people. And I guess when the thing that really kind of was sort of an aha for me is the whole idea of Israel as a narrative. Because to me, like a narrative, I mean, our whole Judaism is based on narratives. So many of our holidays are based on stories, and stories have, they're not just facts and history. Stories have a lot of emotion in them. So for Israel to be a narrative and to really be part of our identity and our story and who we are as a people just means by nature there's so much emotion attached to it. And then to think that Israel's also part of the narrative of other people, part of the narrative of Christians and Muslims and Palestinians, and so it just helped me to think, oh, well, yes, it's so much a part of my narrative, but it's a part of other narratives too, and I have to be able to sort of hold that and deal with that. And I don't know quite how to deal with it, but it just helps me to understand why there's that other people are holding this as part of their narrative too.
Yeah, and stories transmit values also. That the stories we tell say something about who we are and what our self-identity is. And so having to wrestle with that, with the narrative, also means you have to wrestle with who you are and what those values represent to you. And that can be that can be challenging to have your identity questioned in that way. And I wonder a little bit, Esther kind of explicitly said it, but I think I wonder if other people experienced it too. Of this isn't the kind of what I said. This isn't the narrative I grew up with, and so if the story changes, how does that affect? Like, it's not just wrestling with the narrative; it's wrestling with my self-identity and the values that story that I hold on to holds for me. And all that becomes more complicated as well when you start adding those layers onto it. Margaret?
One of the things that interested me most in what he was talking about is his pointing out how Jewishness and Zionism, and Israel have become so intertwined so that you can't think of one without the other. I remember, because I'm much older than many of you, but as a child, I remember that Israel was important, and some, I have some family that were Zionists and were original people in Israel, and some family here that simply didn't consider it that. I mean, it wasn't totally entwined with Judaism. There was Israel, and then there was Judaism, and you could be, a Jew without struggling with Israel all of the time. And his pointing out how, I don't know if he explicitly says that has changed, but he is pointing out how it is, impossible to be Jewish without wrestling with Israel, so to speak.
Or without taking a position, at least. Right?
I would prefer to say wrestling.
Okay.
You can.
Okay. Any other comments, thoughts?
I had one thought. I'm sort of wrestling whether to keep my mouth shut or not. And I think it's interesting that like one of the things that I both liked and really annoyed me was the idea that Israel's important because it's a narrative. And I think I was trying to figure out why it bothered me. And I think what I am sort of struggling with, I think it bothered me because I think it is important because it's a narrative, but not for the reasons that he says it is. And I think to me, it's important because it was a country created as a narrative, but as a narrative going forward. Like there was this narrative of we deserve a homeland, especially after the Second World War. And we have this homeland created by an international organization following this narrative that then had to like run smack into the real world. A lot of times you make narratives to explain what's already happened or for people who are marching forward. But in this case, it was sort of a narrative built around us as a people and then shoved into the real world, irrespective of the desires of most of the people who actually lived in that geography and the neighbors in that geography. And I think to me, that's what makes it so important, is that it's a narrative that was made to collide with the real world. And then we've been trying to pick up the pieces and figure out how to make the narrative meet the real world ever since.
Yeah, I'm trying to
It seems,
process.
I just want to say it's such an interesting perspective because it does seem like that particular narrative conflicts with this other narrative that Lisa was talking about, where we're part of everyone's narrative. It's not just our narrative. And you know, this colliding with reality, the two narratives are colliding.
Well, yeah, and I think I think if our story weren't important, particularly to the predominantly Christian West, I honestly don't think the United Nations would have done anything anyway. It's the fact that our story as Jews is important and the story of the Holy Land is important that made anyone care at all. If we were Somali, nobody would care. Nobody would have cared after World War II because Somalis don't fit into a grander narrative that really impacts the West as a whole.
It's interesting because I was having a conversation this morning about Israel also, and I said like along the same lines, like all these protests that are popping up all over the place, either pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, whatever. How many protests do you see about Sudan right now,
Mhm.
Or even Ukraine
or Ukraine?
or
Like
North Korea,
Korea,
Uyghurs in
Thailand,
China.
and Cambodia almost went to war last week, and barely anybody noticed. Um, like I saw a couple things on it, but it was like kind of buried down on the page. Um, but yes, to some extent, it's. To, I wonder to some extent, you know, is it because it's Sudan, so it's not part of the Christian conversation. It's not part of the Jewish, so it's kind of off our radar, even though what's going on there is horrific. Um, but it's just
Well,
kind of, it's
yeah, I
just
think
not part of
what's
it.
really interesting is like the country of Israel was created by a large consortium of international bodies. Not saying good or bad either way, but I think that also makes the world in a larger sense responsible for what happens to Israel. France is France. France has been doing France for years. Germany's been doing Germany. The rest of the world doesn't feel responsible for what they do. They may have to react to it, but they're not responsible for it. And I think in some ways, because the United Nations and a whole bunch of countries voted to create Israel and it wasn't unanimous, the world has to feel a sense of sort of ownership and interest and responsibility for what happens in this thing that they helped create.
Barbara, Brandy?
I think one of the answers that's commonly given for why it's so big has to do with access and why the world knows a lot more about what's going on in Israel. Now, I'm not saying that's not because of the Christian population, but I think that the fact that the news comes so much from Israel, where we don't hear Sudan and we don't. So I guess it could be that newsmakers or news stations are consciously deciding not to talk about the ones that don't sell, but Israel has a certain level of access that North Korea, for example, doesn't, or perhaps other areas. So that's an answer that we've heard many times before. I don't know the solution. You stop sending out news from Israel. You kick out all the newscasts. Just get rid of everybody. Like what will happen to the US?
You know, the more I'm thinking about it, he brings up like everybody's kind of like there's a lot of investment here. The Muslims are invested in the conversation. Christians are invested in the conversation. Jews are invested in the conversation. When you put them together, that's what percentage of the world population is invested in this little strip of land in some way, shape, or form. And yeah, you know, we don't have the same level of investment in what's going on in Korea or Thailand or Sudan, but that's an interesting question. Like access is part of it, but it's also, I think, investment. And I'm trying to not be cynical about the media, so I'll just stay there. Any other thoughts before we try to go into a little more? But
I have not, Rabbi, can you hear me?
yes.
I have not read, obviously, joining today, but economically, Israel fits in the picture of the world more than some of the other countries, I think. Would that not play a part? Oil, you know, that's all we hear is oil, oil, oil. And I sometimes wonder if that gives, no one looks at us, they're looking at the Arabs who are controlling this oil that we need. I don't know if he goes into any of that. I'm looking forward from listening to all of you.
He doesn't talk about oil as much, at least not in this chapter, at least not that I recall.
Mhm.
And somebody correct me, I don't think Israel has a whole lot of oil to be selling
Right.
anyway.
Yeah, but the
So
people around
their
them.
economy comes from elsewhere.
Right.
And until recently, Israel hasn't had a very prominent economy. I think it's the tech boom that's really made Israel have a really growing economy. Until then, it was kind of struggling.
Right.
Yes.
But I would think that would tend to argue that we ought to pay less attention to Israel, not more. So I think that suggests that the economy is not the reason why we pay attention.
Yeah, I was just referring more to the, you know, to OPEC and all of that, and whether that's why the journalists spend so much time on that rather than the Sudan and rather than other places that they don't ignore but aren't prominent.
Right. He does not talk about that in this chapter, but I've definitely heard the argument you're talking about, especially maybe 20 years ago, saying we need to get off of our dependence on oil. Otherwise, Israel doesn't have a chance because we're always going to be America. As Americans, we're always going to need the oil from the Arabs. So then that's going to change our perspective. So I know that argument you're talking about.
Yeah. I happened to come into my mind, like I say, I haven't read anything yet. I'm waiting for a Rabbi Amazon to deliver my book. And so I'm looking forward to catching up to all of you.
I mean, another subject that
Go ahead. That's okay.
that he didn't address in this chapter was the military prominence of what Israel can do. And I think there's this little tiny country, Israel, and they're helping with the Iron Dome and the other anti-aircraft, anti-drone, anti-missile technology. Really is, if you compare what Sudan can do militarily and technologically, and Israel, I think it shows one reason why Israel is so prominent, because people want to learn from Israel about what they do militarily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the intelligence community in Israel too. I think that goes along with what Stuart is saying.
So TK, you had your hand up before.
Yeah, I think all these are very good arguments, and they certainly are all relevant. But my gut says there's something else going on, and I keep bouncing back to the question why, that I have asked myself and other people have asked for a long time, which is, why is it that the Jews always end up being scapegoats and the object of discrimination and the object of loathing in many cases? And I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's tied up in some way with this question of why the focus on Israel. In my mind, almost all of it that I see is negative.
Barbara Allen, were you going to respond to that?
Well, what you said about Israel, I mean, Jews always being the scapegoat, reminded me, I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to hear Rabbi David Wolpe in Colorado, and he talked about how throughout history, the Jewish people have always been the other, and just human beings hate others. I mean, that's just part of our tribal nature. And in a positive, in an uplifting way, he was saying that's a difference in America. I mean, there are lots of others. Everybody's other. We're not the one other like we were in Russia, or we were in, Poland or France or wherever. So it just brought that to mind, that some of the scapegoating over history makes sense when you think that we're always the outsider, and maybe hopefully that will be different in America, but it doesn't really feel like it is that different.
I mean, what's interesting to me about it is I think we're getting othered in two different ways. I think the far right, anti-Semitism is othering us by saying you are different, and it resembles kind of a lot of the classical traditional anti-Semitism, that they're different, they believe differently, they act differently, they're not like us. The far left anti-Semitism is saying they are mainstream, and I do believe there's a racial element that's getting played into this as well, at least on the left, that I keep reading into. That as Israel is considered a Western democracy, it comes off in that sense as European white. And so it becomes this European whites oppressing these poor brown people. And I think that is a level that's getting played up in left-leaning liberal conversations. And I think that is an angle in which they're viewing this, disregarding the fact that most Israelis I don't think would be considered white, but I also think there's this level there it's being played off as a Jew-Muslim battle. Again, disregarding the fact that there's a decent number of Palestinians who are Christians too. So I think it's getting generalized and skewed in certain conversations, but the whole picture is they're losing the forest for the trees in a lot of ways. And I think that's affecting a lot of the debate and conversation around it also. Sharon, you had your hand up before. You have to unmute, but. See if this helps. It does not seem to be helping.
Sharon, you're still muted.
I think she's trying to figure out how
Try
to.
pressing your space bar and holding it down. Sometimes that will unmute you.
I think she's on a phone. And admittedly, it is a little weird. It is a little harder to find on a phone. I've had that problem in the past too.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Let me try this. So I'm trying to take in everything that folks are saying, and it's helping a lot because I found the chapter difficult to read in a lot of ways. So I'm responding more to what people are saying, and I've been trying to balance two aspects of what Israel means in the world. And there's the history of anti-Semitism and the darkness that we've experienced, and that is always in the background. And then there's Israel, who at its inception, as was mentioned earlier, took on the aspect of being kind of heroic, and how they treated the land and how they prospered, and the singing and dancing. I'm sure not everyone saw that. And then the Holocaust comes around, and I think people take the assumption that having been abused and beaten and killed in the Holocaust, that we would come out with not ever having a whole different set of values. Not that what we had before wasn't, but really wanting to be better than that kind of darkness. But what it's done is bring out anti-Semitism, because it's like, oh, these people are no better. Israel is no better. We wanted to ascribe heroic qualities, and they're not just Jews, but I think other countries too. I've heard it. And it's exaggerated, that anti-Semitism, and it's challenged Jews too, to how we think about Israel, because whether we how we feel about how things are going on now, and against really wanting to see Israel in a heroic way, it's very challenging to the world and to us. That's all.
I hear what you're saying. I want to challenge it a little bit.
Okay.
If you don't mind. Like, in some sense, that feels like a different kind of othering that TK mentioned before, that we are supposed to be morally superior and better than everybody else. And I think aspirationally, aspirationally, I think that's an okay place for us as Jews to want to be. To say that we want to be moral, we want to take the high ground, we want to always make the best choices. And we're still people. And people inherently make mistakes. People inherently don't always choose the right thing. That's why we have Yom Kippur. Because we recognize we're imperfect beings living in an imperfect world, and we're not always going to make the perfect choice. So, on one hand, trying to put us up on a moral pedestal is aspirationally maybe okay, but realistically probably not.
No.
But then to use the fact that we're not perfect against us isn't necessarily right either.
No.
Does that make sense?
Yes, because it's about perspectives. And I think what I was talking about is people's perceptions about Israel. Did people think of Israel differently than the Jews? I don't know. Did anyone have any concept of how Israel was perceived when they saw it as a little more heroic rather than just being the Jews?
I think what you're saying, though, fits into the narrative. The narrative is this is a heroic country. So, and we're part of that heroism, and we're so proud of it. So it does make it, and then that hits the reality, as Joshua said, of nobody's that perfect, and we're all human, and there are mistakes. So I think that fits the conversation about the narrative, and then the narratives clashing.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to be. I agree with Barbara. I just want to be a little wary of saying, we're supposed to be better, and we should have learned from the Holocaust to be better, because that, in some sense, puts us in a almost non-person category, that we're supposed to be morally ideal, which.
Rabbi, I wasn't thinking that. I was saying I think that was the perspective.
I understand. I'm just trying to push back on that perspective a little bit and point out that there is a problem with that idea also. And I think it's one thing for us to want to strive to be good and strive to be morally right and strive to overcome our basic human impulses. I think that's a big part of what religion tries to teach generally. And the rabbis specifically, talk a lot about overcoming the Yetzer Hara and the evil inclination. And sometimes they even talk about it in warlike terms of like trying to battle down your baser instincts and battle down the evil inclination, and overcoming it and being victorious over it. And yeah, we have to, that's part of the religious strife. And if we didn't have to do that, then, we wouldn't have to be teaching it. Because ultimately we're still people. Joshua, you look like you were going to say something before.
Yeah, I think there's always the interesting issue of Israel as a state versus Israel as the people. But I think to push back a little bit about aspirations, part of the problem that I always have with this dilemma is there's an explicit problem of if you have a country created by people wanting to adhere to some idea of international law and the United Nations and things, then the country as a government has real trouble if it doesn't follow what the United Nations has set down as its parameters. So I think that's part of the problem that I think you get with Israel. It's not even talking about individuals' moral adherence or standards, but whether the government itself is doing essentially following the blueprint by which it was created. That's it. It's hard for me to resolve.
Yeah, it's funny because my instinct is to go with the Zionist defense, which is, well, it's really hard to follow the rules when the enemy is not. But your point still stands nonetheless.
And when the country, the institution that created you doesn't really stand by you. That's the United Nations. I mean, I'm not sure they really are standing by Israel fundamentally. I mean, the whole thing is messed up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying I totally agree with either side in this, but like I think like the most glaring one I always went up is like what to do with the West Bank, because if like the United Nations says Israel can have a state, but the West Bank is not yours and settlements are illegal, and Israel's like, no, never mind, we're going to have settlements in the West Bank. You're like, okay, so you've got one authority saying you can exist, but not here, and it's messed up. And I understand there's no easy answer for any side in this.
No, I agree with you. It's very complicated.
And that's kind of been my basic position for, what are we? Trying to do math in my head. 22 months now is, if there was an easy solution to this, we would have done it already. But it's incredibly complex, incredibly complex, and incredibly emotional because of the narratives that surround it and how people are tied up in their values and identities are tied up into it. And I get the sense the question of identity is going to come up more next chapter and next week. Just basing that purely on the title. You're not supposed to judge a book by its cover. I don't know if you can judge a chapter by its title, but based on that, I'm guessing that's what it's how it's going to play out next week. Is how does he's kind of outlined an idea of Israel. Now, how does that play out in terms of Jewish identity, and what role does it play within that more specifically? Stuart, you look like you were about to say something. But...
Well, yeah, I wanted to get back to this anti-Semitic idea relative to Israel. Anti-Semitism existed through the millennia without Israel being there. And so there's classic anti-Semitic trope that we all know about related to previous millennia. Then Israel is created. So now there's this another aspect of anti-Semitism that many people in the world believe in. So for me, I have to accept additional anti-Semitism if I want to support the state of Israel, which I do down to the core in me. For, as he said, the deeper explanation for a lot of this anti-Semitism for many Jews is that Israel is central and essential to my Jewishness. So I can't imagine now in the new world within Israel, which was created, I can't imagine not being supported just because somebody wants to find another reason to not like me or like other Jews.
Yeah, Margaret?
The question that has always nagged at me is why it is that the Arab states, Jordan and so on, who snatched up the land that was supposed to be a Palestinian state, how do they get off scot-free? Why does it always devolve on the Jews that it's the Jews' fault that the Palestinians do not live in there, do not have their own state? I mean, I know they also made decisions that the Palestinian Authority also made decisions that led to that. But nags at me that the Arab states get off. It's simply not part of the discussion.
I don't know if I have a good answer.
It is part of the discussion, isn't it? Like,
Well,
I didn't think he did, but if you find it, Joshua.
well, no, it's not part of his discussion, but it's part of the bigger discussion.
Yes, yes. I thought you were saying you found it like you thought.
No, I don't think he goes into that. And
no, he alludes to it without going into it, but it, in general parlance, if you read the newspapers, if you talk to people in general, that is not alluded to. Maybe
I don't know. I guess when I've talked to people about it, I hear a lot of people saying, how come Jordan doesn't take the Palestinians? Why won't Egypt take the Palestinians?
But who says that? Jews say that. You hear other people say?
Yeah, I hear other people say. I have a friend and colleague from Egypt who she about that, and I've talked to a few other people who are like, why are they stuck in camps when there should be other countries that are willing to take them?
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. I only hear that from.
So it's out there, but I agree with you. It's not as big a part as it seems like it ought to be.
I have heard that, at one point both Jordan and Egypt tried to absorb some of them, and they kind of tried to immediately overthrow the government both times. And so they're not super eager to take them back. After that, Cindy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I got part of the same discussion, and you seem to have answered that, because it's something that always has bothered me, that why haven't the other Arab states helped their brethren, and that that the Palestinians in Jordan are still in a refugee camp after like how many years? And the fact that and what Feldman wrote about, that the land that was supposed to go for a Palestinian Arab state was taken by Jordan and Egypt. So yeah, it's always bothered me why they haven't had more help from the other Arab nations. And now I'm even more incensed that that Jordan, I never knew this before, that Jordan and Egypt didn't help them and hurt them, in the same way. So
look, I think trying to think it through rationally, like everything else in this, there's two sides to the conversation. One side of the conversation is, why should they become Jordanian and Egyptian citizens when they were kicked out of their land in the first place, and they don't want to go to Jordan, they don't want to go to Egypt, they want their houses back. That's kind of, I think, one version of it. I think the flip of it is, on some level, for those Arab countries that don't really want a state of Israel either, this is a convenient place to keep them, because they'll continue to be a problem for Israel, and therefore they don't have to do anything, and they still get to cause problems. So that's a little bit of a cynical view of it, but I have heard that argument being made also, is that this is, why should they, when this is helping them get the cause that they ultimately are looking for?
Unfortunately, people get displaced all the time. If you look over the history of even over the last 100 years, how many populations have been displaced, and people kind of, except for the people involved, other people just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, it happens.
I also think that, when other peoples are displaced, oftentimes other countries do allow them to come in. I think these other Arab countries don't want the Palestinians because they know they're terrorists, and they don't want that problem in their country. The part that frustrates me is they never, and this may speak to what you're saying, Rabbi, that they really don't want Israel there either, but those who have come to some sort of peace with Israel, you would think that they would, and I know there's a lot of pressure because there's a lot of Arab countries that they have to keep peace with, but it is frustrating to me that the world doesn't say, these are terrorists. Hamas is terrorists. Let's get rid of the terrorists, and then we'll, because I mean, I'm going to assume that most normal, regular Palestinian people, although when you live through this kind of horror that they're living through, they're never going to come out, I don't know. There's going to be impact on their personalities and their views, but even just prior to this, if the world could agree to get rid of terrorists, then maybe there could be some peace, and there would be a place for all people who who want to live in peace and comfort and just live their lives, which I think is what most people at basic level want.
I mean,
That's idealistic, but
I say it's a beautiful sentiment. It's just practically like, how do you get rid of terrorism?
Real.
Just for example, 24 years almost, we've been trying to get rid of ISIS. How do you actually do that? Like, how there was long conversations of the war on terror, but practically speaking, how do you do it? And that's a much, ideally, yes, that I think that's great. Practically, it's a much more challenging concept to do. Barbara Brandy?
When the Palestinians ended up in Jordan, in Egypt, in Syria, and the camps are miserable, but they were sold a bill of goods. They were told, we'll get rid of Israel and this will only be a temporary thing. And it's been a temporary thing now for 70 years. But that bill of goods has gone on for generation after generation. And as people said today, there's been no willingness, and there have been too many reasons why they've never been accepted in the various countries. They are used as guest workers. Kuwait has got lots of Palestinians, but they're Palestinians. They're not Kuwaiti citizens. They're not welcomed into the country except as workers. So the relationship between the Palestinians and the surrounding countries is horrible. They don't have a chance there. So why not fight for their own state? And I don't mean that, but I'm saying that's their attitude.
So, it is getting late and we're coming up on our time. So I want to close us off with a couple of thoughts. I had the thought when we were first starting the class that, we're going to get through this and then come to, man, I wish for the days of discussing something as controversial as God. In some ways that feels like an easier conversation than this does. Ultimately, where I think Feldman is trying to encourage us is to say, whichever side of the aisle you're coming on, whichever side you're approaching this on, you ultimately, can you open your heart a little bit to acknowledge that the other side is possible as well? And if so, what does that mean for you, and how do you wrestle with that? And as we saw last week with the chapter, a lot of what he is big into the wrestling generally. And so how does moderating our story a little bit and understanding that the story we might accept is not the full story, how does that affect our values and our self-identity along the way? And how do we wrestle with those conversations, acknowledging it's hard and it's complex and there's no easy solution? How do we wrestle with it in the meantime? And so hopefully starting next week, we'll get a little more insight a little more insight into that. Small piece of administration. I was kind of flipping ahead a little bit, and the next chapters are getting very long. They're about 30 pages each. I will leave it largely up to you whether you want to try, push forward with the full chapter next week, knowing we might have a conversation on half of the picture of what he's trying to do, or whether you're good going a full 30 pages and then discussing the full chapter next week.
I would say for myself, I don't mind reading 30 pages, but I'm asking you if, I don't know if you've read ahead, if you feel that you can, that's enough time to discuss everything that's in those 30
I
pages.
have not read ahead, so I don't know the answer to that generally. My instinct is a little bit based on the previous chapters that getting half of the picture is going to make it harder without knowing what the other half is going to say. But I do understand that, y'all have busy lives and you might not be able to get to 30 pages in the next week. So that, because this isn't, light beach reading either.
Well, this week was 25 pages, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that. I don't mind doing 30 pages. And if we don't get to fully discuss it, or if people haven't fully read it, we can always continue it the next week. I think I would prefer to have the option to read the 30 pages.
Okay.
And if people haven't been able to it, then we, discuss what we discuss.
And if we get through, if we read the full 30 pages and we don't get through the whole discussion, we can happily push another discussion of the full chapter the following week if we don't get to it all. We can certainly do that. I just won't assign a further reading if we do that, and that way, if you don't finish it all, you can finish it the second week. So we can kind of monitor and see how it goes. Barbara Brandy, you look like you were going to say something. So.
No, I just unmuted myself to be able to say thank you for a great discussion. I think that it was not an easy chapter, and that it brought up a lot of things that I wasn't exactly aware of, because your own experiences give you a certain perspective. We've used the word perspective. And it's true that I'm like Esther's first favorite person, Benny Morris. And if I look at it as a teenager compared to how I look at it today, there are differences. And I wonder if our teenagers today recognize that, because often, and I've heard this said many times in Women's League international meetings, that our kids don't have the same perspective that we have. How is their perspective going to change over time?
I think in some sense they're reflecting a little bit of the rest of the community that I feel is very much in defense mode of trying to defend our faith in Israel and our belief in Israel and our ideals of what Israel can be, and feeling very defensive about it and somewhat wary of any form of criticism.
That's right.
For fear of giving fuel to those who are anti-Israel. And I think the teens are feeling that also, that they might not always agree, but they don't know how to voice that criticism without eliciting more anti-Semitism. And frankly, I've seen rabbis posting the same thing of criticizing, like, how can you criticize Israel right now? You can't do that right now. That's a whole nother thing, and we might get into that next week also in some way. Or as we move forward, we might come back and have that conversation more too.
Ezra Klein did an interesting podcast on why parents and their adult children are having conflict over this issue. Difficult time. I don't know if other people have heard that, but I can.
Yeah. But it's not what the rabbi said. The rabbi made it sound like the young people are trying to defend Israel. I think we're talking about the young people who are mad at Israel.
Right.
Or those are the, I mean, the more idealistic kids who feel that.
Who we taught to be humanists and who we taught justice and who we gave them those Jewish values, and they're using them, you know, now.
I have heard that a lot over the last couple of years too.
Feldman is going to talk about that explicitly.
Yeah.
Oh.
And not every Jewish teenager has the Israel experience that our kids, if you're at camp with Israeli counselors, or if you've had the opportunities to be in Israel much. There are a number of people who only know what their own experience has given them without the exposure to anything from the Israeli side of it. So that's
but you brought up Benny Morris before, and I think that might be a good way to wrap up our conversation. That, you know, what does he do? He, as depicted by Feldman, he kind of changes his position over time, but he changes his position without changing the facts.
Yeah.
And not asking anyone to change their position necessarily, but how can we use the facts? How can we use what we know and be open to hearing things that we don't know, and using that to inform our positions more generally? And that might be the goal that we have to wrestle with, is knowing what we know. What does that mean? And how do we interpret things from there? So, Kol hakavod, everyone. Thank you very much for coming and learning together.
Thank you.
Modeling some civil conversation and debate. We'll look forward to learning together next week. So be well, everybody. And if I don't see you before then, or if I don't see you tomorrow night at Musical Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.